No, I don't.
Let me just make sure it's on, and then we'll start. Yes.
Estelle's saying YouTube. She can't get it on YouTube.
There was a problem. It should be okay
When
now.
the bishop was here.
Yeah.
I think that's when
There was a problem. We fixed it. So now it's
Liturgy never got recorded right on YouTube, I think.
yeah.
It didn't come out on
That was totally goofy.
and it's not closed caption.
I think I could press a button that allows it. I'll have to look into that. You guys keep challenging me with more.
I don't know. I don't even know that that's what it's called.
All right, let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, everywhere and fills all things. Treasury of blessings, giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, a good one. Through the prayers of our holy fathers, O Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. So today, we have a very exciting class on ordination. And we're going to talk a little bit about the hierarchy. I don't think we talked about that yet. And today is show and tell. So I'm going to show you all the different priest vestments and all that, and what it all means and why we have all this stuff. So anyway, we're going to have a little interesting class, hopefully today. Next week, we're going to have the much anticipated class on death. Death. That's always a good one. And then the week after, the seminarian will be teaching, and it'll be on icons. So I gave him his project, and so he's working diligently on his class. Of course, I sent him all my notes. I said, just follow my notes. It's easier, but no, let him figure it out. So ordination. So if we hear that word ordination, which is a Latin word, I'm not going to try doing the Greek word because my Greek is horrible. There he is. We were wondering. We were just saying.
I got caught up at work.
Okay, that's all right. The actual term, Chrysantheos or something like that, my Greek's horrible. It actually means laying on of hands. And so that's really when we talk about ordination, there is this understanding of what it means. And we're going to talk about the biblical part, why that's so important, the laying on of hands. Because again, as you have probably figured out, we don't do anything that's not in the Bible, right? So anyway, so ordination is the setting aside of qualified men to various positions within the church. So that's two things that we have to think about. The setting aside to be leaders in the church, okay? No one, how do I put it this way? You are not ordained out of your own will. You are ordained because you are called by God. God calls you to that position, not you. And believe me, as a professor at seminary, I see lots of people aspire to be ordained, but that's the wrong way of thinking. You go through the training, and then God calls you to be ordained. And it is something that is, remember we talked about baptism and chrismation, and we used that wonderful word. There's an ontological change, something, a very change in who you are, the very essence of who you are. The same can be said of ordination. That when you are set aside and called by God, that you are, and then have the hands laid upon you, that there is a change in that person. And actually the prayer that the bishop does over the priest when he's ordained is that which is lacking is filled by the Holy Spirit. So anything you as a person lack, and believe me, I lack lots, is in my position as a priest is filled, not as Father Eric, but as the priest who stands at the altar. And so the grace that God gives to me is not necessarily me, but it's the position. Okay? And then that change, that ontological change then, just as with baptism and chrismation, there's that change in the essence of who you are. Which is why, in a certain sense, when a priest is buried or a bishop is buried, in the strict traditional way, they cover his face in the casket. with the air. You know, the cloth that we have over the chalice, they cover that, his face, because you're not supposed to remember Eric. You're supposed to remember the priest. And when you are ordained, when the priest is let out to be ordained, he has that over his head. He's being offered, like the communion. He's being offered to God. So I think that's an important thing. Sharontonia. Herotonia, laying on of the hands.
The roll of the tongue.
What? The roll of the tongue, right. So, there are two sets of ordained or ministry, okay? There's what's called the minor and the major, all right? So the minor orders are reader and subdeacon, okay? So who's a reader? So a reader is someone who is tonsured. Remember, we talked about that. That's the other time you could be tonsured. And they are basically, just like the word says, they're there to read in the church, to chant. Cantor is another word for it. And so the reader is a lay person who is set aside to help with the order of the church. And they wear a cassock, just a cassock, nothing else. So if you remember Theogenes, when he was here, Theogenes was a tonsured reader. Not that anybody could read, but to have someone who's a tonsured reader. We're trying to get George to be a tonsured reader, but he won't let us do it. And so their job, in a sense, is to assist the priest in the running of the service. So many choir directors may be tonsured readers. Many altar servers will be tonsured readers. Okay, there is necessarily no requirement other than it being a good person who lives a good and orderly life. And it's interesting, when they tonsure a reader, what they do is you'll come out, the bishop will pray, he'll tonsure, and then he'll open the gospel or the epistle randomly and point and say, read this. And so the person has to read that out before everyone. So why would they do that? Well, think about, they have to make sure they actually know how to read, right? And they didn't memorize the verses, right? So they have to actually read, and so then you'll start chanting, and then they'll say, okay, that's good, and then they'll close the epistle. And then he's vested in a robe, just like this. So they have a cassock, and then they'll just get an altar server's robe, right? Most of the readers, unless they're serving, won't wear this when they're doing the chanting and stuff. But sometimes, like on Pascha and stuff, they'll put on the robe for that sake. And so that is what a reader in the church is. Any man can look to do that. They even do young boys. My friend Father Tim Honicki, his son was just tonsured. He's like 14. I wouldn't inflict that. But anyway, so that's what a reader is. The next one is subdeacon. All right, a subdeacon, you saw them when the bishop was here, right? The bishop, you saw those guys, and they had their robes on. I'll see if I can still do it. And they go, how you doing, Andrew? And you saw that they wore around their waist, they wore it like this. Not bad, right? Remember that? And they carried the chiquita indicator. So a subdeacon is basically a glorified altar server. It's what it is. All right? And so, oh, look, I messed up. Anyway, so so they get this special thing, and they're basically the bishop's assistant. A subdeacon is also, he's not tonsured, but he has a prayer and a laying on of hands before the liturgy begins. That's the appropriate time for that. And very often the subdeacons can be not only the bishop's assistants, but they can also be kind of like the senior altar server in the altar, things of that nature. Like George. Cadil. Exactly. Thank you. We're going to start pressuring him. By the way, both those positions are always made in conjunction with a liturgy. And you could do multiple ones in this sense. You can tonsure multiple people at one time. Whereas for deacon and priest or bishop, it can only be one candidate at one service. All right. So like when I was at seminary, all the new seminarians who had not been tonsured, first service, they lined you all up and they went right down the line. The Metropolitan always came for the first liturgy, and all of us were tonsured readers at that service. Subdeacon, I never actually left the church building as a subdeacon. I was made a subdeacon, even though I had served as a subdeacon. Many people serve as it, but not the official position. I got made a subdeacon at the beginning of the liturgy, and then I got ordained a deacon at that liturgy. So I never even left the building. So, and again, when I put candidates forward for reader or subdeacon, one of the things I want them to be able to do is put the services together to know how to run it. Because in the absence of clergy, this is particularly true in Alaska, the readers run the parish. Like they don't have a priest assigned to all these villages. Maybe they'll get a priest every 2 months will come through. So they do what's called a reader's service, which is basically a divine liturgy without the Eucharist, without the priest parts. But then he gets a permission to read the gospel, and sometimes they'll actually send sermons out for them to say on behalf to read on behalf of the people. So readers, like in Alaska, a reader is a very important position in the village. He's usually one of the elders of the village, and he not only is he the elder of the village, but he's also the elder in the church. So some of them have very important positions. Some people have been readers their whole life. You can be divorced and remarried and become a reader or subdeacon. That's the level that as far as you can go. All right, so that's the lower level. By the way, the subdeacon will wear a cassock as well with nothing on it. Yes?
What if your divorce was before becoming Orthodox?
Doesn't matter. Yeah. One marriage.
I thought I heard someone say that they couldn't become a reader because they're...
No, they could become a reader. They could become a subdeacon. Yes, Andrew?
Is there a significance to that X pattern?
You know, I think Christ, ICXC, Jesus Christ. It's interesting because there are different traditions. For example, when I was a young man, right, and you aspired to become the senior altar boy in my church, right? And so all the young men, when they got to be their teens, they were blessed to wear, this is a kind of a Carpatho-Ukrainian, they wore it like this, right? And that, ooh, you were a big shot, right? You got to wear the stole. And then when you became the subdeacon, you went like that. So. And if you notice when we have a deacon, during the Lord's Prayer, the deacon will actually take his stole and then he'll do this with his stole before communion, which is basically so that it doesn't get in his way. And so he'll do that. And then right after communion, after we put the gifts back, he's got to go and he's got to get it on very quickly again and get out here to start the litany. So there's all this. You can see how well trained the deacon is if he can do it smoothly, without too much drama, shall we say. All right? So that's what the reader is. That's what a subdeacon. Normally in parishes, the normal tradition, though it's by far not as strict at all, you have one reader per parish, right? But very common. In some parishes, you have 4 or 5 tonsured readers. Same thing with subdeacons. You usually had just 2, but now it's very common. You can have like 8, some of these large parishes. Then you have the senior subdeacon, the senior reader, we like hierarchy in the Orthodox Church. All right? So, as far as how they're made, again, it's before the liturgy begins, which should show you where that ordination happens in relation to where the liturgy is. Okay? And really, it's a very simple service. It's the setting aside, and there it is. And if anybody eventually wants to be considered, talk to me, and we'll make it happen. Bishop asks me every time he comes, is there any tonsuring? Anybody? I'm working on it. He's ready. He's got the scissors, ready to go. So that's the lower level, the minor order of clergy. Okay. Then we come to the next level of clergy, which is the deacon, priest, and bishop. All right, and before I get into that, I want to, where do you think those three positions come from? Anybody have any idea? This word diakonos, presbyter, and episkopos. Anybody know where those are mentioned? Thank you. Yes. The threefold ministry comes straight from the Bible, okay? And so in some places it just had two ministries. It had the diakonos and episkopos. Then in other places it had the three ministries where it starts talking. So when you hear the word diakonos, which is Greek for server or servant, right? So that helps you understand what their job is. They are two.
When you say it's in the Bible, was it like Old Testament carry over from?
Well, that's funny you mention that, because it's those three in that name are New Testament, but they are actually based on the Old Testament, where they actually talked about the qualifications for the priesthood, and think the priesthood in the temple, right? And at that time you had to be of a certain tribe, right? Aaron or Melchizedek, we heard that in this morning's epistle, right? And that because you had to be of that certain tribe, they would take men from those tribes to set them apart to serve in the temple, to serve the sacrifice and all that stuff. As we see it as Christians, it's no longer the tribe that you are, but the priesthood comes because Christ is the high priest. He did the last sacrifice himself personally. It opens it up for everyone who are now qualified. Yes, Sam?
So there were three tribes?
I think it was two, right? Aaron?
What was it?
Well, Levi,
right?
yeah.
Because they held the Ark of the Covenant.
Right. So, and that's funny you should ask that. So, like Exodus 28, you shall put them, Aaron your brother and his sons with him, and you shall anoint them and ordain them and consecrate them, that they may serve as priests. So this is from Exodus. And then Exodus again, the holy garments of Aaron shall be for his sons after him, in the way be anointed and ordained. And for 7 days one of the sons of the priest instead shall put them on when he enters the tent to meet, to minister in the holy place. So think about that. Well, we're going to go through the garments that we wear. We're coming right from here. Yeah.
So how did consecration and anointing work? So here we anoint with the oil.
But that's not the same anointing.
Do they just pour the oil? Did they? Because that's what Samuel did to David.
Right, they poured the oil on.
That's
Yeah.
it, just pour it on.
When I put on, well, we're going to get to that. When I put on my stole, there's a prayer that's associated with each of these. And the prayer when I put on my stole says, like the oil running down the beard of Aaron, which, blah, 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 blah. It's supposed to represent the oil flowing down.
And what is it? The consecration?
The laying on the hands.
That's there.
Yeah. So, anyway, anointed priest and da-da-da. So, anyway. I would like, there's something that's kind of interesting, because while we're on the Bible, I wanted to pull this out. So if you get to be a nice young priest, and you get ordained, these are some of my crosses from when I was a young priest. We'll talk more about that. You'll see on the back of the cross, I'll use this one. This cross is from 1787. On the back, it's in Slavonic. Right? You can't really see it, but you'll see there's some writing in here. And all the priest's crosses have that same writing on the back of it. And what does it say? It says, it's from 1 Timothy. Let no one despise your youth, but be an example of believers in words and conduct and in love, in spirit, in faith, and in purity. So it's reminding the priest what he's supposed to be. So every time you put on a cross, you're supposed to. When you get to be old like this, then you don't have to have that reminder. But anyway, so that's that 1 Timothy passage is the passage that is always extolled to priests on what you're supposed to be. An example. Okay? There's others where in Acts, you see a lot of it where the first bishops are chosen, right? The first people to replace the apostles are chosen, right? The bishops are the successor of the apostles. And you'll see when, for example, Judas, right, he goes and betrays, so they have to replace him. So they vote and they lay hands on him, on Matthias, who's the replacement. That's where this whole tradition starts about the laying on, where it's continued, shall we say, on the laying on of hands. I'm just trying to go through some of this. There's a lot of different things in which you see Acts 6, Acts 14, where it talks about what are we going to do about the elders. So you have a bishop, episkopos, which means overseer. All right, so he's the overseer. So the bishop is in charge of a particular region. Now, in the early church, the bishop was in charge of a church. But the church expanded, and you started to have different churches in different places. So that's where the ministry of the elder, presbyter, priest, which is Greek for elder. So wherever you see in the Bible it says elder, read it as priest. Right? That's very important because a lot of times people, no, read it in the Greek. It says the priest. When it says, for example, for unction, which we'll do next week, in conjunction with the death class, gather the 7 elders and pray over the sick person. I'm just paraphrasing. It means literally gather the 7 priests.
Why don't they, if it's an incorrect translation or misleading translation?
Why do you think?
Because people are stupid about changing things, because that's the way it's always been translated?
Protestants didn't want
If they said priesthood,
pastors and things like that.
they use pastor and all that. So because they don't, if you actually technically translate it correctly, it changes the whole connotation. And they're arguing against this idea of a sacramental priesthood. Yeah.
Why?
Because they believed in the priesthood of all believers, which we believe. Everyone is, right? We talked about the priest, prophet, and all of us are given that. But some are set aside to serve the liturgy. And remember, they didn't do the liturgy. They didn't believe communion was the body and blood of Christ. That it was more important to preach the word, for example, than to offer the sacrifice and stand at the altar. So that's why they changed this. They started changing the context of that. With me? Good. I don't want to get too deep on that, but nonetheless. So the bishops then became in charge of regions. Cities, regions, eventually bigger and bigger. Okay, we'll get back to hierarchy in a second. I just want to give you this idea of the threefold. So as they did that, they had the elders. The elders were the ones who helped run the church. And the elders were given, and specifically says in Acts, that the elders had the hands laid on them by the apostles. And the elders became the priests. They were the priests who served the liturgy on behalf of the bishop. I serve here on behalf of the bishop, right? I am a representative of the bishop, which is why he comes around and he checks on his priests. Remember the antimencia on the altar, which is signed by the bishop, giving me the permission for this community to exist. And then you assign a priest on his behalf. So this is not my parish. In a sense, it's not even your parish. It's the bishop's parish that we hold in.
His stead.
Yeah, in a sense. But it's not quite so hierarchical because there's a synergy here, right? You have to have the people with the bishop, and with the bishop where the people. St. Cyprian of Carthage would say, where the bishop is, there is the church. Right? That's an important way of thinking. So you have to have the gathering of the people, you have to have a leader of the people, and therefore you have to, and that answers to the bishop. Now that's why when a priest is ordained, the candidate is brought out into the center of the church, okay, by 2 people who are deep, like at that point you're a deacon, you're going to be made a priest. And then he bows once, They say command and he bows. Then he turns them around and he bows his command and you bow to the people. And then you're brought up into the altar. You bow one more time, command, and then the deacons let him go and the priests who are in the altar take him in. Okay? Why is it coming? Because I'm coming from among the people. I'm not here because the bishop. I'm here being drawn from the people. And they used to do that. Who was the pious person in the parish who knew the services? And they still do this in many places. That's the person we're going to have to be the elder and the priest of that parish community. They didn't have seminaries or any of that stuff. That came later. Yeah.
So that's what you were referencing when you were talking about Alaska? Like the elder?
Right.
Oh, wow.
So you literally, and then when the priest, after he has the hands laid on, we're going to talk about the service in a second, he's then presented before the people. And each garment is held up. And the bishop says axios, which means worthy. And everyone is supposed to say back, axios, axios, axios. Worthy, worthy, worthy. And then they put on each part of the garment until he's fully vested. If someone, and this has happened, where the bishop has said axios and someone yelled anaxios or unworthy, the ordination stops. And they have to investigate, why is this person considered unworthy by that? Because we are pulled from the people to be the elder, if you want to call it, or the priest of the people. It's not like we get magic put on us, but we are changed into our way we function before the people. Does that make sense? You with me on that? Okay. So then the other one was the deacon, right? Diakono. He was the servant. And so the deacon was there to assist in the service. When we have the deacon here, right, did you notice he does most of the stuff? Yeah. And when you have a bishop here, the priests are irrelevant. We sort of stand around. Every now and then we get a little crumb thrown to us, like, yeah, do this. The deacon liturgically kind of runs the show. I always like him to, he's like, if I'm like the lieutenant, he is my sergeant, right? And the sergeant, as anybody who's an officer in the army knows, the sergeant really runs everything, right? And so you have the deacon whose job it is to serve, but in the early church, his job was to make sure that everyone was visited, that he went out to the elderly and the widows and all the people, the sick, and made sure they received communion, received all these sort of things. The deacon was authorized to bring communion to them. And in some cases, we still allow that. And so the deacon was there to serve and to report back to the elder what was going on in the community to make sure everyone was being cared for. All right, you with me? So those are those three, and they had their hands laid on. It's right in the Gospels. I won't go any more through the Bible. And very early on in the church, like I'm talking before the Bible was even written, the early church fathers had already had this established. And by 325, the First Ecumenical Council, all the regulations about how a deacon, a priest, and a bishop function have been pretty much established. They even started to, how does a bishop function and another bishop is next to him? Can I go, like a bishop cannot walk into this church from another diocese unless the bishop of this church allows it. Nor can I go walk into another church unless that bishop knows I'm going to be there. So like if I go on vacation, I write to the bishop and say, I'm going to be in so-and-so and I want to attend this service. Is that okay with the bishop there and my bishop? And I can't leave. If I go on vacation, I have to write and say, I plan to go on vacation this date, and I have to get blessing from my bishop to go away from my altar. And then I'll find a substitute or whatever. And it's not a big deal, but it's just to keep good order. Because you had bishops who would then try to go to other dioceses and cause, or some cases, bishops would try to climb, well, this diocese is poor, but if I aspire to that diocese, I can get a richer diocese. And you're not supposed to. Once you are made a bishop, you are married to that diocese. That's what they call it. When you lose a bishop, they actually call it widowed. The diocese is widowed. Until such time that a new bishop.
I never realized that, because they move priests around
right.
really regularly, but bishops are...
Very rarely will you see bishops move. It happens at times if there's a particular need or whatever. But if you're made the bishop of a diocese, You're supposed to stay there until you die or retire, whatever comes first. So we take it very seriously about how that happens and how that works. Because again, order. Order. All right. What else do I need to say about it? Again, this is Orthodoxy 101, not deep theology on all of this. So, a deacon, by the way, cannot bless, right? So when you see a deacon, you can't get a blessing from him. He can't consecrate gifts. He can't perform any of the sacraments. I know in the Roman Catholic Church, the deacon can do weddings and other things because they see it differently than we see it. They see it as a witness to a contract. But a deacon cannot do that. Only a priest or a bishop can do it. Can only bless or consecrate the gifts or do any of the sacraments. So if you noticed when the bishop was here, he had a very set sort of function liturgically that he could do. All right? With me? All right, so let's talk. By the way, 2 very good books. These are required reading for my students, by the way. One is John Chrysostom's 6 books on the priesthood. It's quite an intense book. And it talks, I'll just give you an example of some of his headings. The difficulty of pastoral care. Love, the chief thing. John continues to call it the glory of the priesthood. The difficulty of the priesthood, which should always go together. Particular duties. How do you deal with widows and the sick, the virgins, the arbitration, visiting, excommunication. The penalty for failure. There are a lot. Every time you see a canon about what a priest should be doing, means that some priest probably wasn't doing it, and they had to get strict with him. And some of the things are some are held very strictly. Like, for example, a priest cannot be away from communion for more than 2 Sundays. Two Sundays in a row. So, there are very strict sort of rules about how you do it. A priest should not be going into a theater. Now, we know they don't follow that. Well, the theaters didn't have the best repute, and it was where lots of prostitution and other stuff happened, and they didn't want the priest to put himself in that position. We don't think of theater like we know it now. Think of theater like it was. Now don't follow it. There's all these sort of things, how you dress, what you do, how you talk to people. When you get ordained as a priest, you have an oath you have to sign. And that oath actually tells you the things that you are responsible for. For example, one of them, you will keep a Christian home clean and orderly to be an example for people. There's all sorts of things like that. You will serve. You will not take money for sacraments. You will not do, you're not allowed to do any of that stuff. You can't sell the sacraments. And you have to sign that. And believe me, I've had cases and we've had to pull out the ordination oath and say, you signed this, and you did this, and you knew better, sort of thing. The other book, by the way, is St. John of Kronstadt's Counsels on the Christian Priesthood. And again, the priest person, the priest in temptation, the priest in prayer, the priest in the celebration of the divine service. The priest is pastor, the priest is preacher, the priest is teacher, the priest is confessor. The priest is intercessor, the priest of healing. You could see how serious it's all kind of taken when they have these reflections. I do this to scare my seminarians. You better hold up to this. It's serious stuff we're talking about. We're talking about people's souls, right? We're talking about people's souls, and how you are as a priest will affect their salvation. And that will be on your soul. So all of you, that's why I always ask you to pray for me, because I have all your souls on mine. Right? And I will answer for everything I've done as a priest. You don't have to answer for your stuff. I have to answer for all your stuff. But it's a joyful burden, a joyful and light burden. Anyway, so, what? No. Yeah. There are days now. Tanya's a daughter of a priest. She knows, families see what the priest pulled away. He's got this issue, that issue to deal with. It's tough. So the rules for becoming, this applies for deacons and priests. They equally apply. So you have to have the proper education as the synod of bishops determine. All right. So in some cases, seminary is the most common way now. But there are programs like late vocations where we'll do training for people to become deacons. And in some cases, there will be, especially if you have a shortage of priests, they will do an individual training for a particular person to ordain him. So however that bishop decides and the church as the synod decides. You have to be a husband of one wife. This is right from Timothy, right? And that's the same for your wife. So you can't be married and divorced it has to be a first marriage for both of you. And you have to be married before you're ordained, and I'll get into that in a second. So, and that's supposed to represent the ideal. You're supposed to be an example, and this is the ideal. Now, do priests get divorced? Yep, it happens, but they're not allowed to remarry and remain a priest. Okay, you have to then stay as a celibate. So you have two types of priests. You have the black clergy and the white clergy. This is not racist. The white clergy are the married clergy, and the black clergy are the monastic clergy. So you have two parallel ranks that go up, whether you're a monastic or whether you're a married clergy. All right, we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so and then there are other things. You have to have a father confessor who will vouch for you at your ordination, and there's a few other sort of requirements before you're done. In the OCA, for example, when your time comes for you to submit your name, you're asked to submit your name for ordination. It goes before first the seminary council, and the seminary council decides whether to recommend you to the Holy Synod for ordination or not. Then your father confessor, mine was Father Hopka, has to write the recommendation for your ordination. Then it goes before the Board of Theological Education and the Holy Synod, who then either approve or disapprove the ordination. And then it is usually the bishop of where you came from will do your ordination. So if you're, like I was New York, New Jersey, Archbishop Peter did my ordination to diaconate, which is today, my anniversary, my ordination to diaconate. It's 28, 29 years. I was only a deacon for a few months. My father-in-law was a deacon for one day. Made him deacon and then priest the next day. And then that bishop, or he may ask another bishop to do it. You'll set the time for when you'll be ordained, whether it's deacon or priest. You could do a deacon and priest at the same service, but you can't do two deacons or two priests. You could do one of each. And then, and I was ordained to the priesthood by Metropolitan Theodosius, which is not I was the Ed Day sacrificial lamb. See, we're making priests. We'll make one for you right now. Look. So, anyway, and and so that if it's other than that route, the normal seminary route, if it's another way, they will. That's where the Board of Theological Education, which has the deans of the seminary and a couple of bishops who sit on there, and they'll make the decisions according to a packet that is submitted. That this may be an exceptional circumstance in which to ordain this person. Okay, Sam, you had a question?
Oh yeah, it was how come bishops? Maybe you addressed this already, but how come bishops don't get married? I know you.
I'm going to get to that.
Okay, because in that verse you pulled,
it talks about the bishop. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was just.
Yes. So we're going to get to that in a second. Anyway, so a deacon is ordained at an earlier. No, the priest is ordained before the anaphora. No, he's before the gospel. The bishop is before the gospel. The priest is before the great entrance, and the deacon is before the anaphora. Just to let you know. So basically, the service for priest and deacon are fairly similar. We already talked. You're led out, you're presented to the people, and then you're brought in to the altar where the bishop will be sitting to the left of the altar in a chair. And you're to kneel before him, and he will bless you. He will then pray over you, and then you will be lifted up, and then you are led by a priest 3 times around the altar table. You get to choose which priests. Father Hopko was my first priest. Father Casinda was my second priest, who was my parish priest. And who was my third? Oh, Father Laser was my third priest. And as they sing the same hymns that we talked about that they do at the wedding when you go 3 times around, those same 3 hymns are sung. And you kiss the 4 sides. So the priest goes. If it's a deacon, it's the same thing, except you're being led by 3 deacons. And you kiss the 4 sides of the altar. And then after the 3rd time around, you are then placed, go to the side, and the bishop will then place his stole and his hands on you. This is the laying on the hands. He'll do a long set of prayers, and then he gives you words that are between you and the bishop, which are basically, be a good priest. Don't screw up. Metropolitan Theodosius had known me since I was a teenager, so it was kind of a beautiful moment for him to, I've watched you grow up and all this sort of thing. And then after those, then you are led out here to the ambo, and that's where they vest you with each piece of garment and the oxios, and you put it on, and then you're finally, the last thing they give you is a service book. It was kind of nice. My service book was the one I had since I was a little kid, and you have your, that's the last thing, and then you're presented. And it's interesting, then you're taking your position. Now you're the most junior priest in the world, right? But you actually stand next to the first priest because he's there to make sure you don't screw up. And you have your first litany, your first, all that sort of thing that you're supposed to do. The other thing they do is after the gifts are consecrated, with the deacon, he'll have a fan, the liturgical fan, and during the Lord's Prayer, he'll be going over it and doing the fan. For the priest, they put the lamb in your hands. And they say, you are responsible for every particle. And you will answer before God for protecting the body of Christ. That's a very humbling moment, when you do that. And, and that's it. The other, there's a funny tradition where the new priest, everybody wants to get his blessing, right? Because you're fresh, you haven't, and I have all these older priests who I've known, all my life, they come up and get your blessing. The most humbling was when my father came up and I started crying. I've seen my dad cry twice in my life, and one of them was at my ordination. And he came up and he got the blessing from me. You're like, oh my God, this is like serious. And anyway, and then you have to serve your first service. So the tradition is, and I'm glad we've restored this, where the new priest will serve a liturgy every day. It used to be for a month. Now they do it for a week. So you serve every day with someone who watches over you and makes sure you know how to serve and you know what to do. Same with a deacon. Usually the new priest will go to a monastery for a month to make sure that you're really prepared. And it's fun when you get to be the priest who watches the new priest serve. So I sit there. They're all good. They do really well. Now for the bishop, as we talked about before, a bishop cannot make another bishop. You have to have 3, at least 3, right? That's to make sure that, because this is the highest position, this is the succession of the apostles, right? You have to make sure it's a succession of people, not someone going out there and making everyone bishops. It's got to be the church represented. No, I rarely seen it where it's just 3. Usually it's 10, 15, 20. They're all laying hands. And there's a whole specific part about the bishop where they actually take the gospel to all the bishops and they place it on his head, opened up on his head. And there's a special prayer, and that gospel he keeps with him until he's buried with it. And there's a whole thing about how he's vested and all that, and all the bishops laying hands. But the basic outline is all the other ordinations. Okay? Are there any questions on the ordination service or any of that?
Like what, I mean, say multiple bishops would come, what if someone comes from like a Greek archdiocese?
We do that all the time.
So,
We'll serve together, yeah. You'll invite different bishops from different jurisdictions. It's a nice way to show unity,
yeah.
you know. And it's a way. So yeah, we participate in other consecration of other bishops and other jurisdictions. They do with us as well. So yeah.
Is it the same with the priesthood at all? Like you can have priests from
Oh yeah. I mean, you can have there, but priests don't lay hands. Only bishops lay hands.
Right.
So if we have like at seminary, sometimes we'll have a visiting bishop from overseas, and there's an ordination. The metropolitan will give him permission to do the ordination for that priest.
So we have in the OCA of North America, and is it South America as well?
No, we're just North America.
Just North America.
Yeah.
And then he's called the Metropolitan.
Right.
And above the Metropolitan.
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, because of course in Orthodoxy there's two systems. There's the Russian system and the Greek system.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll get to that in a second. So next thing I want to do is I want to just show you some of the vestments and things, okay? So as you can see with the deacon, right? So the deacon has, basically it's an altar boy's robe. He has the cuffs, and then he has the stole, right? The stole. Now, there are various levels of deacons, of course, right? We have different ranks. So you have deacon, and then when you become a senior deacon, you be called archdeacon. And instead of, the deacon wears it like this. It's his angel's wings, right? If you notice Deacon Stefan, his kind of went like this, right? That means he's been given what we call the double stole. He's an archdeacon, all right? And then you may get the hat, the kamalavka. I'll show you what that is in a second. Kamalavka. And then you have the proto-deacon. The proto-deacon is the big shot. He's the sergeant major. He's the bishop's deacon, right? You have proto-deacon, then archdeacon. So it's proto-deacon is the double, then archdeacon. The archdeacon you don't mess with, especially if it's the metropolitans or the patriarch's archdeacon. That's like, they're beautiful. They know what they're doing. They run the show. They're big shots, all right? So those are basically those positions. If you hear someone called a hierodeacon, that means it's someone who's a deacon and a monk. So monks also, so they have a hierodeacon, then a hieropriest, meaning he's a priest and a monk. All right? Then you have igumen and archimandrite, but we'll get to that. So anyway, so that's what the deacon wears. All right? Now, the priest. So the first thing the priest wears, and each of these is what's called my stikar. What does it look like to you?
Baptismal.
What?
Is it the baptismal?
It's a baptismal robe, right? It's just it's not as fancy as that. That's all that is a baptism robe, which is a nice. So the priest, and again, there's different services require you to get fully vested or just partially vested, all right? So that is all that is. It's just that with a cross on back, right? And why does it have strings? Because you can't, how do you tie something with one of your hands? So it's, you could just, now they're using Velcro, and I don't like that. I like the old ties. Yeah. Anathema. So, the next set, now, as of course, we have Russian-style robes and Greek-style robes. I like Russian-style robes, just me, high backs, so this is called the Phalonian, right? A Phalonian is your priestly robe, it's your fancy robe, it's your covering. You'll see it from the Old Testament about putting that on, and you have your robe. And it has a cross and a star. It has all different sizes and colors, and some of them I've seen, like St. John of Kronstadt, I wore his Phalonian. It was so heavy. It was so filled with pearls and other things, and it's like, yeah. But that's, otherwise you're dressed shabby, but when you serve the liturgy. The basic mark of the priesthood is this, right? This is the epitachilia, which means around the neck. It's basically the deacon's stole, just brought around and up the middle, right? And it has 7 crosses, 2, 4, 6, and then 1 on the back. So whenever I do anything as a priest, I have to have this stole. So like if you go to my car, I have a bag, I have a stole in there, right? So when I go to visit people or whatever. So this is your basic priestly garment. All right? Then you have the cuffs, right? Everyone likes the cuffs. They think it looks so cool, right? And the cuffs, really, I mean, there's a prayer about the right hand and about, the blessing. But the cuffs were there to keep your sleeves out of everything, all right? So when you see, like, for example, like you'll see on Sunday, because the Father Alexander's serving, and I'll be on the side, I'll have my stole and cuffs on, right? And then if I'm going to bring communion, I'll put my phelonion on. But the cuffs are there, so like whenever you read the gospel, you should have your cuffs at least on. I wear them for Vespers. That's an old Russian thing. We always wear your cuffs during the services, so I just have my tradition. And they each have a cross. Then we have this, the zoni. It's a belt. We like to have fancy names. And the belt is just really to keep things from, flopping around. But there's a prayer about how being girded around your waist. So it's a biblical image. All these are based on the vestments in the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, but it's kind of like our interpretation, shall we say? Yeah.
Do they have any connection to the armor of God?
You're going to see that. Funny, you're always a step ahead of me.
And the prayers when they bless the bishop.
What?
The prayers when they bless the bishop.
Right. So, because I'm holding off 2 of them because I'm going to explain to you. So there are different awards for big priests. I'm going to tell you the Russian system, which started with Peter the Great. He liked to be able to look and see exactly the seniority of a priest, and he equated it to military positions, and we just sort of kept it. The Greeks have less awards. The Russians have lots of them. So the first award you get when you're ordained a priest is you get the right to wear the silver cross, right? So this is the silver cross. They call it the 8-point cross, 3-bar cross. This was given to me by a very dear man who became a monk. And so in the Greek church, you get awarded the cross after a certain amount of time. You get no cross at the beginning. In the Russian tradition, you get awarded the cross. All right? So that's the first thing you get. The next thing you get, and I lost this and now I found it again, is you get the skufia. All right? The skufia. Yeah, I'm not a hat person, but... Yeah. So that's your skufia, which you can wear when you're outside cold, and all that sort of stuff. But it is actually technically an award that you're now a little bit more senior. And you get the pointy hat, right? Like kids used to tease me when I wore that. The next award you get is this, all right? And that's the nadrenik. It's a towel. But the prayer, it's a fancy towel. The prayer that you do is talking about the armor of God on both of these. This is my shield, and the other one is my sword. And so, when you get this, you wear it on this side, and then as you get other awards, it goes to the other side. So basically, it's a fancy towel, but it's supposed to represent my shield.
What is its functional purpose?
Nothing. Another thing to wear. They give you awards and you got to buy more stuff. The next award that you get is you get the kamalavka, right? This is my kamalavka. I got all different colors, but that's my kamalavka. I wear it on Easter and Christmas, and that's your next award. Now, if you notice the bishop when he came in, he had this hat, except in black, but with the monks have a veil over the top of it, right?
The scheme almost, right?
Yeah. So it's a basic hat. It's like, it comes from the fez comes from this, actually. You know, the Turkish fez, it comes from this. So, yeah, so that's my Kamalovka. Then the next award that you get is the Gold Cross, right? If you notice, it's just 2, right? And this one, again, this was given from my father-in-law. It was given to him. It's from 1797. And I don't know if it's real. But, it is. I like to think it is. So you get the Gold Cross, all right? Then you can either get that in conjunction. Normally you get that in conjunction when you're made an archpriest. And an archpriest is basically a senior priest, okay? Archy first. So he just means that you have a certain level. And there's time on each of these. So after so many years, you can get awarded this. After so many years, you can get awarded that, unless it's a special circumstance. Then after you're an archpriest for a while, you get this, the politza, which is your sword. Now, in the Greek tradition, they don't have the square, they just have this. If you see a Greek priest wearing this, that means he has been given permission to receive confessions. Not every Greek priest can give confessions. Okay, so this is one of those, in Greece anyway. So it's also a mark of seniority. If you notice, the bishop, he wore one of these, right? Yeah. So anyway, so that's what this is, the politza. Then, if you're really good, you get awarded the jeweled cross, right? Or the decorated cross. And it's got the little dangly thing, which everyone always loses. And and there's actually different designs. If you see a cross with a blue in the background, that means that person has a doctorate. I have one of them somewhere floating around. If you have a lot of the little things, but the jeweled cross, the decorated cross, which is basically the senior priests. Usually you can't get it before 25 years. I got it early, but that's another story. Anyway, and that's when priests get really ridiculous and they have all sorts of very fancy. Then if we never did this before, but when we did do this, we stopped doing it, and now it's been returned to the OCA, is the very senior priests, 45 years minimum, will receive the mitre. Right? So my father-in-law, for example, has the mitre. So it's just like what the bishop wore, except it doesn't have a cross on top. All right? And that's for the very senior priests of the church. And then each diocese is allowed to give only 1 out a year. Yeah.
So when a bishop is consecrated, is there any relation to any of these steps?
Yes.
Minimum rank?
I will get to you. I will get to that, okay? Because they're going to have to go through the other direction, which is the black clergy. This is all white clergy that I'm talking about, okay? Now, in Russia, because that's not enough, right? They even have other awards. For example, certain priests will be given the permission to wear 2 crosses. So they'll wear 2 crosses, right? And then certain priests will have permission to serve with the altar doors open for the entire liturgy, like the bishop. You don't really see that in America. That's a Russian thing. And then the most senior priest may be given permission to carry the chikiri and tikiri, like the bishop does. But it's very rare to see that.
Please don't reach that rank.
I won't.
I will quit cleaning if that.
Yeah, they're still.
I put hours in.
I know. So that is the level for married clergy. On the black clergy, so you have the hieromonk, right? The hieromonk wears the silver cross, and he wears the monastic hat. Then you have igumen. Igumen is basically a priest, a monk who's in charge of a group of monks. All right? And he wears the gold cross. Okay? Like we saw. And then you have archimandrite. He's usually the abbot of the monastery, or a very senior monk, and he wears the jeweled cross. So in order for someone to become a bishop, they have to be made an archimandrite beforehand. So for example, Archbishop Michael, he was a widowed priest, but he never took monastic vows, so he followed basically the white clergy. You can do that. You don't have to. If you're not a monastic, there are some priests who are just celibate, but don't take monastic order.
He eventually became a monk.
Right. So when he became a monk, when they elected him bishop, they had to start all over in a sense with him. He had to become a monk. Then they made him an archimandrite, and then they consecrated him a bishop. So you have to be at least an archimandrite. And the archimandrite also, if you're the abbot of a monastery or if you're a elected bishop, will wear a mitre. Okay? So those are all the fancy different things that we wear. And
I have a question.
yes,
So Father Anthony at St. Basil?
Yes.
What is his level?
he's an archimandrite.
That's what I
Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't wear any of that stuff.
No.
Actually, when he came on he actually wore his hat and his jeweled cross, and I was teasing him about it because he never wears it.
So what about I'm pretty sure that monks, the schema monks, right? They wear those.
That's a whole different thing. We're going to have a whole class just on monasticism.
Okay.
So monks are normally lay people.
Right.
So they have a whole series of things. But again, you have to take certain monks for the functioning of the community and make them priests and deacons and stuff. So that's technically, if you're a monk, you should not be a parish priest. But they do that. They go out and be parish priests and things of that nature. So, so with the Greek tradition, again, we have a couple of those, but it's the silver cross, and then it's a fancy cross for the Greeks. They don't have all the hats. Everyone wears it. They call it the stovepipe hat. So, yeah, they don't have the different types of hats and all that other stuff. All right, what time are we at? 8 o'clock. All right, we're almost there. Next, bishops. So, there are two different traditions of bishop. A bishop has to always be attached to a city. So every bishop has a city, right? And it usually is the main city or whatever they may decide. So for example, Archbishop Michael, the Bishop of New York, of the Diocese of New York and New Jersey. Archbishop Benjamin, Bishop of San Francisco and the Diocese of the West. Metropolitan Tikhon, Archbishop of Washington, Metropolitan of all America and Canada. So you have a city or see, and then you have a territorial diocese that will encompass a certain territory as the synod decides. So a bishop, which is called your grace, if you hear the term vladika, that's just a very kind of,
It's a loving term.
it's a loving term like dad.
Endearment.
Yeah. Or Ispolaiti despota, you heard that, right? Despota, many years to our despot. No, many years to our bishop. So you have a bishop, and then you have an archbishop. There is no difference between them other than seniority in the Russian tradition. You'll tell them difference because like a bishop will just have the black book, the archbishop will have a little cross on there. It's just seniority. Right? So as you get so many years, they'll make you an archbishop. It doesn't make your diocese an archdiocese, which is just on something that's older dioceses will have that title of archdiocese. So you may have an auxiliary bishop. He's a second, like if you have a large territory, you'll have an assistant bishop to help you cover your territory, but everything is still the bishop. And then in the Russian tradition, you have the metropolitan. The metropolitan is the head of the capital city of that country. So hence, Archbishop of Washington, right? He will wear, in the Russian tradition, he'll wear the white klobuk, like you see in the picture there of St. Innocent over there, all right? And then you have patriarchs. Patriarchs are of ancient countries. So technically a metropolitan and a patriarch are the same. It just depends on how ancient the see is. We're young, so we don't have that, right? But like Constantinople, Jerusalem, Greece, not Greece, because Greece is actually young as an autocephalous church. Alexandria, Serbia, so you have, and they all have their own different traditions on what they wear. A bishop will wear, when he's walking around, he'll have, instead of a cross, he'll have a panagia, which is the Virgin Mary. When he's vested, he'll have a cross and a panagia. If you're a metropolitan, you have 2 panagias and a cross. And if you're the Patriarch of Alexandria, you have 4. He has all sorts of things that he has on. The Patriarch of Moscow wears an old style klobuk that's kind of the pointy dome, which I never knew. See, there's a cross on top, and I was there serving with the Patriarch, and before he got in the car, one of his subdeacons went and flicked the cross down, had it was on a little hinge so he'd break it off. It's like, oh, that's pretty cool. I would have never known that. So when the bishop walks in, you'll see remember he was put on that robe, that long flowing robe. So a bishop wears a red purple one, metropolitan wears a light blue one, and a patriarch wears a green one. Okay? So it could be red or purple. When they say red and purple, it's the same color, like in Russian and all that other sort of stuff. That means the same thing. Yeah.
What's a patriarch? What's the difference between a metropolitan and a patriarch?
Well, so a patriarch is the head of the church, right? A metropolitan, in Russia, they'll have metropolitans where they divide up the territory and then they have bishops underneath them. But in some places, they're not big enough to have that, so the metropolitan's the head of the church. And the patriarch, again, is of an agency. That's why we only have a metropolitan here. This is the Russian system, because I'm going to blow your mind in a second. So anyway, so that long robe is actually a Turkish judge's robe. And if you notice it had red lines coming, that's to represent the preaching of the gospel that flows from him. And then he has 2 tablets, which are supposed to represent the law. And on the bottom, they'll have his initials. Like they'll have E.M., or actually you'll have A.M., Archbishop Michael, right? And so that robe is put on for certain occasions, and he'll have a walking stick, right? He saw he had a little walking stick, and he does that. And so that's basically like your walking around sort of thing, but they don't put it on until they get here because you'll trip over it, and it's very long and a pain in the neck to put on and take off. So then when you saw the bishop getting vested, you'll notice that he had all these different items. So he had the white robe, right, the stikar. Then he had the politsa, right, the diamond. He had the stole. He had the cuffs. He had the belt. So everything just like a priest. And then he had that long garment that went over the top. That's called a sakos. All right, and he had all the bells and the buttons, which you got to know which is which, or else you mess up. And then you have the sakos, which is basically his garment. And then over the sakos, he has what's called the amaphor. The amaphor, everything but the amaphor, the sakos came from the Byzantine emperor. So they all started dressing like Byzantine emperors, basically. Before, they just wore like the priest did, except they would put an amaphor. The amaphor is that long cloth. You have a long one that goes like all crazy around, and then you have a short one. The amaphor is supposed to be was originally made out of wool. And what do you think it represents?
The lamb.
The lamb. Yeah, good job, Andrew. You get the star for the day. That's the lamb that he is the pastor. I'm not the pastor. The bishop is the pastor. That's why he carries a staff. And he has the lamb around his shoulders, right? And so that's what the amaphor. So sometimes if the bishops are serving, like sometimes the metropolitan, he would just wear the priest thing with just the amaphor around. A lot of bishops like that. Archbishop Alexander in the south hates all that stuff and rarely gets dressed up. He'll just do it like with that. You'll see that in some of the icons back there, right? Like you see St. Gregory, the theologian. All he's doing is wearing a priest garment with the amaphor. Now, Archbishop Nathaniel of the Romanians, He had this beautiful wool amophor made when he was a new bishop. Some nun had sewn it from wool, and he always wears it. And he was like, oh my God, that thing looks so old and ratty. But he said, this is so meaningful. I've had it my entire time as a bishop. He's the oldest bishop right now on the synod. And it just means a lot. And he likes the idea of actually being made out of wool, as opposed to all the fancy stuff. And then they have the mitre, Byzantine crown. And then they have, I talked about that. And then they'll have that staff, the jezzel. And that's the shepherd's staff. And we've talked about it. If you notice, like the Roman Catholic ones, they have that kind of it goes like in a circle. That's so they can move their sheep around. Whereas the bishop is the one where you can rest upon and look at your sheep. And so that's the sign of, that's his thing. And it goes up here and it always falls because no one puts it up correctly. And the last thing that a bishop is presented when he is consecrated is the staff. And that's his authority over that diocese. Right? So all that is what the bishop. So in the Greek tradition, you have a bishop, then you have a metropolitan, which means exactly what it says, metropolis. He's in charge of a big city. And then you have an archbishop over that. Then you have patriarch. Why? They're probably correct. The Russians probably did something just to make it complicated, but that's the differences you see. They don't have all the different color hats and stuff. You'll have a bishop. They all wear the same. They don't have the little cross and all the other sort of stuff that happens. Unless you're the Patriarch of Constantinople, he has his own special, or Alexandria stuff. So that's the only difference. So when you hear, in charge of the Greek Archdiocese in this country, he's an archbishop. And each bishop in the diocese is a metropolitan. Where in the OCA, each diocese pretty much has an archbishop with a metropolitan over it. Go figure. Just go with it. And then each bishop has a diocese. And then all those bishops meet together in what's called a synod. All right, a synod, which means a gathering of bishops. So it's very clear. Think of the Acts 15 and about how they organized the First Jerusalem Council, where they gathered together to make decisions on the church and someone presided. Our metropolitan is not, a bishop is not like a patriarch or an archbishop or a metropolitan is not over the other bishops. We don't have that papal model where you have the Pope and everyone's answers to him. He's the center. Think of it, and everyone. You have to have a chairman of the board to run the meeting, and that's what he does. So he's the center of shall we say, not the one over. So all the bishops meet together twice a year in what they call the Holy Synod. It's mandated by the canons. It tells exactly when they're supposed to be. A synod cannot meet without the metropolitan. The metropolitan can't meet without the synod. You have to have, they can't make any decisions apart from each other. And those, so when you hear the Holy Synod, that means that they're the gathering. Now they have something called the Lesser Synod. They'll select a few of the bishops to work with the metropolitan, kind of like if there's, ongoing business that needs to be done. Right? So that's what, and then in theory, so there's different ways in which synods are organized. In America, we don't have enough. We only have 14 bishops in the OCA, so it's easy for them to meet together. In Russia, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bishops. So they're on a rotating basis. Same with Constantinople. They're on a rotating basis who sits on the synod. And then theoretically, we have what's called the Great and Holy Council, when all the heads of all the Orthodox churches should meet together. And the last meeting they had was a few years ago. It didn't go very well. Eventually, they're always planning. They need one, but there's always issues and stuff. And the highest level is an ecumenical council, but you cannot have an ecumenical council because we're not responding to necessarily any theological issue. We don't have an emperor, and the seven is the seven, and that's it. So anything else would be considered a local council or a great and holy synod. which, God willing, they will do again at some point. So that's basic hierarchy. One other thing I would say, so you have a priest is in the parish, you have a dean. A dean is elected by their fellow priests to represent him in a geographical area. So we're part of the New Jersey deanery, because the New York State deanery is really upstate. So we all gather once a year and we elect who is going to be our Father Gary Breton has been elected, because no one wants a job. So the dean is the one who's supposed to watch on behalf of the bishop. If there's issues in the parish, you report it first to the dean. He should be the one negotiating for the salaries and all the other stuff. The deans meet with the bishop every month and do regular business. Then
There's only two.
what?
So there's only two?
Three. New York City,
Oh, it's the city.
New York State, and New Jersey. Some have more. Diocese of the West, it's larger geographically. Then the other one you may have is a chancellor. The chancellor is the senior priest of the diocese. He's kind of the bishop's right-hand man. And so he's usually the senior priest or someone is well respected to do the administrative work on behalf of the bishop. And so that's so again, we're a parish, in a deanery, in a diocese, in a church. Good? Are there questions? I think I covered a lot here. But yeah, Andrew.
Is there a vestment thing that represents the thing from Leviticus where there's like jewels for every tribe?
No, but you have the jewels on the mitres and the crosses and stuff. But it's not like that.
That's like only around the Old Testament, I suppose.
Yeah, the fringes and all the other stuff is representative of that. Yeah. A lot of the vestments really were kind of like the cassock is just really what you walked around in, basically. And then they made it specific so you can identify a priest, right? And so you did see what he was wearing, humility sort of thing.
I suppose if you look at all the saints, they all got robes on.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, you see that there. Yes?
The bishop's crown or hat there, I noticed a lot of jewels. Are those real jewels, like real diamonds, or
They could be. I've seen some, but no.
is it tubes coming?
I don't know. This one maybe. I don't know, but they're probably fake. They're expensive. I've seen some where they are, and you don't want to touch them. We have a set of vestments we had redone that was owned by St. Tikhon. And so then the Metropolitan will every now and then wear those vestments, which is kind of cool. Of his namesake, he gets to wear the vestments and stuff. Other questions? All right, so next week we're going to have that happy subject, death, which is actually a happy subject. And we'll continue this moving on. And we will have a class specifically on monasticism at some point. So you understand, because that's a whole other thing. All right, that's it. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. It is truly meet to bless you, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure and the mother of our God. More honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption, you gave birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify you. Through the prayers of the Holy Fathers of Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Oh, my brother's watching from Mexico. Hi, Dave.